History of Modern Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. Chapter 1. The Philosophical Renaissance. Part 1. For 1,000 years after the schools of Athens were closed by Justinian, philosophy made no real advance. No essentially new ideas about the constitution of nature, the workings of mind, or the ends of life were put forward. It would be false to say that during this period no progress was made. The civilization of the Roman Empire was extended far beyond its ancient frontiers, and although much ground was lost in Asia and Africa, more than the equivalent was gained in northern Europe. Within Europe also, the gradual abolition of slavery and the increasing dignity of peaceful labour gave a wider diffusion to culture, combined with a larger sense of human fellowship than any but the best minds of Greece and Rome had felt. Whether the status of women was really raised may be doubted, but the ideas and sentiments of women began to exercise an influence on social intercourse unknown before, and the arts of war and peace were in some ways almost revolutionized. This remarkable phenomenon of movement in everything except ideas has been explained by the influence of Christianity, or rather of Catholicism. There is truth in the contention, but it is not the whole truth. The Church entered into a heritage that she did not create. She defined and accentuated tendencies that long before her advent had secretly been at work. In the West, that diffusion of civilization which is her historic boast had been begun and carried far by the Rome whence her very name is taken. In the East, the title of orthodox, by which the Greek Church is distinguished, betrays the presence of that Greek thought which moulded her dogmas into logical shape. What is more, the very idea of right belief as a vital and saving thing came to Christianity from Platonism, accompanied by the persuasion that wrong belief was immoral, and its promulgation a crime to be visited by the penalty of death. Ecclesiastical intolerance has been made responsible for the speculative stagnation of the Middle Ages, and it has been explained as an effect of the belief in the future punishment of heresy by eternal torments. But in truth, the persecuting spirit was responsible for the dogma, not the dogma for persecution, and we must look for the underlying cause of the whole evil in the premature union of metaphysics with religion and morality, first effected by Plato, or rather by the genius of Athens working through Plato. Indeed, on a closer examination we shall find that the slowing down of speculation had begun long before the advent of Christianity, and coincides with the establishment of its headquarters at Athens, where also the first permanent schools of philosophy were established. These schools were distinctly religious in their character, and none was so set against innovation as that of Epicurus, falsely supposed to have been a home of free thought. In the last Greek system of philosophy, Neoplatonism, theology reigned supreme, and during the 2½ centuries of its existence no real advance on the teaching of Plotinus was made. Neoplatonism, when first constituted, had incorporated a large Aristotelian element, the expulsion of which had been accomplished by its last great master Proclus, and Christendom took over metaphysics under what seemed a Platonic form, the more welcome as Plato passed for giving its creeds the independent support of pure reason. This support extended beyond a future life, and went down to the deepest mysteries of revealed faith. For, according to the Platonic doctrine of ideas, it was quite in order that there should be a divine unity existing independently of the three divine persons composing it, that the idea of humanity should be combined with one of these persons, and that the same idea, being both one and distinct from Adam, should involve all mankind in the guilt of his transgression. Thus the Church started with a strong prejudice in favour of Plato, which continued to operate for many centuries, although the first great schoolman, John Scotus Eriugena, 810 to 877, incurred a condemnation for heresy by adopting the pantheistic metaphysics of Neoplatonism. As the Platonic doctrine of ideas came to life again in the realism, as it was called, of scholastic philosophy, so the conflicting view of an old opponent, Aristotle, was revived under the form of conceptualism. According to this theory, the genera and species of the objective world correspond to real and permanent distinctions in the nature of things, but apart from the conceptions by which they are represented in the intellect of God and man, those distinctions have no separate existence. Aristotle's philosophy was first brought into Europe by Mohammedan conquerors of Spain, which became an important centre of learning in the earlier Middle Ages. Not a few Christian scholars went there to study. Latin translations were made from Arabic versions of Aristotle, and in this way his doctrines became more widely known to the lecture rooms of the Catholic world. But their derivation from infidel sources roused a prejudice against them, still further heightened by the circumstance that an Arabian commentator, Averroes, had interpreted the theology of the metaphysics in a pantheistic sense. And on any sincere reading, Aristotle denied the soul's immortality, which Plato had upheld. Accordingly, all through the 12th century, Platonism still dominated religious thought, and even so late as the early 13th century, the study of Aristotle was still condemned by the Church. Nevertheless, a great revolution was already in progress. As a result of the capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders in AD 1204, the Greek manuscripts of Aristotle's writings were brought to Paris, and at a subsequent period they were translated into Latin under the direction of St. Thomas Aquinas, the ablest of the schoolmen, who so manipulated the peripatetic philosophy as to convert it from a battering ram into a buttress of Catholic theology, a position still officially assigned to it at the present day. Aristotelianism, however, did not reign without a rival, even in the later Middle Ages. Aquinas was a Dominican, and the jealousy of the competing Franciscan order found expression in maintaining a certain tradition of Platonism, represented in different ways by Roger Bacon (1214 1294) and by Duns Scotus (1265 1308). In this connection we have to note the extraordinary fertility of the British Islands in eminent thinkers during the Middle Ages. Besides the two last mentioned, there is Eriugena, born in Ireland; John of Salisbury, 1115 1180, the first humanist, William of Ockham, and Wycliffe, the first reformer, making 6 in all, a larger contribution than any other region of Europe, or indeed all the rest of Europe put together, has made to the stars of scholasticism. This advantage is probably not due to any inherent genius for philosophy in the inhabitants of these islands, but to their relative immunity from war, and to the political liberty that cannot but have been favourable to independent thought. 5 out of the 6 were more or less inclined to Platonism, and their idealist or mystical tendencies were sometimes associated with the same practicality that distinguished their master. The 6th, commonly called Occam, who died about 1349, is famous as the champion of nominalism, that is, of the doctrine that genera and species have no real existence either in nature or in mind. There are only individuals more or less resembling one another. He is the author of the famous saying, the sole legacy of scholasticism to common thought: entities ought not to be gratuitously multiplied. Entia non sunt praeter necessitatem multiplicanda. The capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders had led to Aristotle's triumph in the 13th century. 200 years later, the conquering Ottoman advance on the same city was the immediate cause of his overthrow. For the Byzantine scholars who fled for help and refuge to Italy, brought with them the manuscripts of Plato and Plotinus, and these soon became known to Western Europe through the Latin translations of Marsilio Ficino. On its literary side, the Platonic revival fell in admirably with the humanism to which the schoolmen had long been intensely distasteful, and the religious movement that preceded Luther's Reformation found a welcome ally in Neo-Platonic mysticism. At the same time, the invention of printing, by opening the world of books to non-academic readers, vastly widened the possibilities of independent thought, and the Reformation, by discrediting the scholastic theology in Northern Europe, dealt another blow at the system with which it had been associated by Aquinas. It has been supposed that the discovery of America and the circumnavigation of the globe contributed also to the impending philosophical revolution. But the true theory of the earth's figure formed the very foundation of Aristotle's cosmology, and was as well known to Dante as to ourselves. Made by a fervent Catholic, acting under the patronage of the Catholic Queen par excellence, the discovery of Columbus increased the prestige of Catholicism by opening a new world to its missions and adding to the wealth of its supporters in the Old World. The decisive blow of history of modern philosophy came from another
This is
quarter,
a LibriVox
from the
recording.
Copernican
All
astronomy.
LibriVox recordings are in the public
What the
domain.
true theory of the Earth's
For more
motion meant for
information or to
philosophy has
volunteer,
not always
please
been
visit
rightly understood.
LibriVox.org.
It seems to be commonly
Recording
supposed
by Pamela Nagami,
that the
MD.
heliocentric system
History of Modern
excited
Philosophy
hostility
by Alfred
because
William
it degraded
Benn.
the Earth from her proud position
Chapter
as
1,
center of the
The
universe.
Philosophical Renaissance,
But the reverse
Part
is true.
1.
According to
For
Aristotle
1,000
and
years
his
after
scholastic
the schools of
followers,
Athens were
the
closed
center
by
of the
Justinian,
universe is the lowest
philosophy
and
made
least
no real
honorable.
advance.
The
No
circumference,
essentially
the
new
highest
ideas
and
about
most
the
distinguished
constitution of
position
nature,
in it, the workings
and
of
that
mind,
is why Earth,
or the ends
as
of the
life were put
vilest
forward.
of the four elements,
It would be
tends to the
false to
center,
say that during this
while
period
fire,
no
being the
progress was
most
made.
precious, flies upward.
The civilization of the Roman
Again,
Empire
the
was
incorruptible
extended far
ether
beyond
of which
its
the
ancient
heavens
frontiers,
are composed,
and although
shows
much
its
ground
eternal
was lost in
character by
Asia and
moving
Africa,
forever round in
more
a
than the
circle of which
equivalent
God,
was
as
gained in
prime
Northern
mover,
Europe.
occupies the
Within Europe
outermost
also,
verge.
the gradual abolition
this
of slavery and the
metaphysical
increasing
topography is
dignity
faithfully
of
followed
peaceful
by
labor
Dante,
gave
who
a
even
wider
improves on
diffusion
it
to culture,
by placing the
combined
worst
with a
criminals,
larger
that
sense
is,
of
the
human
rebels and
fellowship
traitors,
than any
Satan
but the
with
best
Judas
minds
and
of Greece
Brutus
and Rome had
Cassius.
felt.
In the
Whether the
eternal
status
ice
of women
at the
was
very
really
center of the
raised
earth.
may be doubted,
Such
but the
fancies were
ideas and
incompatible
sentiments
with
of
the
women
new
began to
astronomy.
exercise an
No
influence
longer
on social
cold and
intercourse
dead,
unknown
our
before,
Earth might
and the
henceforth
arts of
take
war
her
and
place
peace
among
were
the
in some
stars,
ways almost
animated like
revolutionized.
them, if animated
This
they
remarkable
were,
phenomenon
and
of
suggested
movement
by
in everything
analogy that
except
they too
ideas
supported
has been
teeming
explained by
multitudes
the
of
influence of
reasonable
Christianity, or rather of
But the
Catholicism.
transposition of values did
There is
not
truth
end
in
there.
the contention,
Aristotle's
but it is not the whole truth.
philosophy
The
had been
Church
based
entered
on a
into a
radical
heritage
antithesis
that she did
between
not
the
create.
sublunary and the
She
superlunary
defined and
spheres,
accentuated
the
tendencies
world of
that
growth,
long before her
decay,
advent had
vicissitude,
secretly been
and
at
the
work.
world of everlasting
In the West,
realities.
that diffusion
In
of
the sublunary
civilization, which
sphere
is her
also
historic
it
boast,
distinguished
had been
sharply
begun and carried
between
far
the forms
by
of
the
things,
Rome whence her
which were
very name
eternal,
is taken.
and the matter on
In
which
the
they
East,
were imposed.
the title of
An
Orthodox,
intangible,
by which the
evanescent
Greek
thing
Church is
related
distinguished,
to form as
betrays the
possibility
presence
to
of that Greek thought
actuality.
which molded her
We
dogmas
know that
into
these two
logical
convenient
shape.
categories are logically
What is more,
independent
the
of
very
the false
idea of
cosmology
right
that may or may
belief
not
as
have
a vital
suggested
and
their
saving
worldwide
thing
application.
came to Christianity
But the immediate
from
effect of
Platonism,
having it denied,
accompanied
or
by
even
the
doubted,
persuasion that
was
wrong
greatly
belief
to
was
exalt
immoral,
the credit
and its
of
promulgation
matter or
a
power
crime to be
at
visited
the
by the
expense of
penalty
form
of death.
or act.
Ecclesiastical
The first to
intolerance
draw
has
these
been made
revolutionary
responsible for the
inferences from the
speculative
Copernican theory
stagnation
was
of the Middle
Giordano
Ages,
Bruno,
and it has been
1548
explained as
to
an effect of the
1600.
belief in the future
Born
punishment
at
of
Nola,
heresy by
a South
eternal
Italian
torment.
city not far from
But in
Naples,
truth,
Bruno
the
entered the
persecuting
Dominican
spirit
order
was
before the age
responsible
of
for the
15,
dogma,
and on
not
that
the
occasion
dogma
exchanged
for
his
persecution.
baptismal name of Filippo,
And we must look
for
for
that
the
by which he
underlying
has ever
cause
since
of the
been
whole
known.
evil in the
Here he
premature
became
union
acquainted
of
with the
metaphysics
whole
with
of
religion
ancient
and
medieval
morality,
philosophy,
first effected
besides
by
the
Plato,
Copernican
or
astronomy,
rather by the
then
genius
not
of
yet
Athens
condemned by
working
the
through
Church.
Plato.
At the
Indeed,
early age of
on a
18,
closer
he
examination,
came into
we shall
collision
find
with the authorities,
that the slowing down
and
of
at 28,
speculation had
in
begun long before the
1576,
advent of
he
Christianity,
openly questioned
and
the chief
coincides with the
characteristic
establishment of its
dogmas of
headquarters at
Catholicism,
Athens,
was
where
menaced
also
with
the
an
first
action for
permanent schools
heresy
of philosophy
and
were
fled from the
established.
convent.
These
The
schools
pursuit
were
must have been
distinctly
rather
religious
perfunctory,
in their
for Bruno
character,
found himself
and none
free
was
to
so
spend
set
2
against
years wandering
innovation
from
as
one
that of
Italian city to
Epicurus,
another,
falsely
earning a
supposed to have
precarious
been a home of
livelihood by
free thought.
tuition and authorship.
In the last Greek system
Leaving
of
Italy
philosophy,
at last, rather from a
Neoplatonism,
desire to push
theology
his
reigned
fortunes
supreme,
abroad than from
and during
any
the
fear of
2.5
molestation,
centuries of its
and
existence,
finding France
no
too hot
real
to hold
advance
him,
on the teaching
he
of
tried
Plotinus
Geneva
was
for a
made.
little while. But on
Neoplatonism,
being given to
when
understand
first
that he could
constituted,
only
had
stay on the
incorporated
condition
a
of
large
embracing
Aristotelian
Calvinism,
element,
returned to
the
France,
expulsion of which
where
had
he
been
lived
accomplished
first for
by
2
its
years
last
as
great
professor of
master
philosophy
Proclus,
at Toulouse,
and Christendom
3 more
took
in
over
a somewhat
metaphysics
less
under
official
what
position
seemed a
at Paris.
Platonic form.
Thence
The
in
more
the train
welcome,
of the French
as Plato
ambassador,
passed
he
before
passed to
giving
England,
its creeds the
where his
independent
2 years'
support of
sojourn
pure
seems to have
reason.
been the happiest and most
This
fruitful
support
period of his
extended beyond
restless
a future
career,
life, and went
it
down
was
to
cut
the
short
deepest
by his
mysteries
chief's
of
return
revealed
to
faith.
Paris.
For,
But the philosopher's
according to the
fearless
Platonic
advocacy
doctrine
of
ideas,
Copernicanism,
it was quite
made
in
that
order
bigoted
that there should be
capital
a divine
impossible.
unity existing
The truth, however,
independently
seems
of
to
the
be
three
that
divine
Bruno
persons
never could
composing
hit it off with anyone,
that the
or
idea
any
of humanity
society
should be
in
combined
the next
with one
5
of
years
these
spent in
persons,
trying to make
and that
himself
the same
acceptable
idea,
at one
being
German
both
university
one and
after
distinct from
another,
Adam,
should
are a
involve
record of
all
hopeless
mankind
failure.
in the guilt of his transgression.
Finally, in an
Thus
evil
the Church
hour,
started
he goes
with a
to
strong
Venice
prejudice
at the
in favor
invitation of a
Plato,
young noble,
which continued to
Mocenigo,
operate for many
who, in
centuries,
revenge for
although the
disappointed
first great
expectations,
John
betrays
Scotus
him to the
Eriugena,
Inquisition.
810 to 877,
Questioned
about
his
his heresies,
a condemnation
Bruno
for
showed
heresy by
perfect
adopting
willingness
the
to accept
pantheistic
all the
metaphysics of
theological dogmas that he
Neoplatonism.
had formerly denied.
As the Platonic
Whether he
doctrine of
withdrew his
ideas
retractation on being transferred from a
as it was
Venetian to
called,
a
of
Roman
scholastic
prison does not
philosophy,
appear, as
so
the Roman
conflicting
depositions are not
view
forthcoming.
of an old opponent,
Neither is
Aristotle,
it clear why
was
so long a
revived under the
delay
form
as
of
6 years
conceptualism.
from 1594
According
to
to this theory,
1600,
the genera
was
and
granted to the
species of the
philosopher
objective
when
world
such
correspond
short
to
work was
real
made
and
of other
permanent
distinctions in the nature of
It
things.
seems most probable
But
that
apart
Bruno,
from the
while
conceptions
pliant
by
enough
which
on
they are
questions of
represented in the
religious
intellect of God and
remained
man,
inflexible
those
in
distinctions
maintaining the
have no
infinity of
separate
inhabited
existence.
worlds.
When the
Aristotle's
final
philosophy
condemnation
was
was
first
read out,
brought into Europe
he told
by
the judges
Mohammedan
that he heard it
conquerors
with
of
less
Spain,
fear than they
which
felt
became
in
an
pronouncing
important
it.
center of learning
In the
the
customary
earlier Middle
euphemistic
Ages.
terms, they had
Not
sent
a
few
few to
Christian
death by
scholars
fire.
went there to study.
At the stake, when the
Latin
crucifix was
translations
held
were
up to
made
him,
from
he
Arabic
turned
versions of
away his
Aristotle,
eyes.
and in this way
With
his
what
doctrines
thoughts we
became
cannot
more widely
tell.
known to the lecture
There
rooms
is a
of the
monument to the
Catholic
heroic
world.
thinker at Nola,
But their
and another in
derivation
the
from
Campo dei
infidel
Fiori
sources
on the
roused
spot where he
prejudice
suffered
against
at
them,
Rome,
still further
raised
heightened
against
by
the
strongest
circumstance
protests
that an
of the
Arabian
ecclesiastical
commentator
authorities.
Averroes had interpreted the
The
theology
Greek
of
Italian
the
philosophers,
philosophers in a
the
pantheistic
Pythagoreans
sense,
and Parmenides,
and
had
on
introduced
any
the idea
reading
of
Aristotle
finiteness
denied the
or
soul's
limitation
immortality
as a
which
necessary
Plato had
condition
upheld.
of reality and perfection
Accordingly,
into thought.
all through the 12th
From
century,
them, it passed over to
Platonism
Plato
still
and
dominated
Aristotle,
religious thought,
who made it
and
even
dominant
so
in
late
the
as the
schools.
early 13th century.
Epicurus and
The study of
Lucretius had
Aristotle
indeed
was still
carried on the
condemned
older
by the
Ionian
Church.
tradition of infinite
Nevertheless,
atoms and infinite
a great
worlds
revolution was
dispersed
already
through
in progress.
infinite space.
As a result
But
of the
their
capture of
philosophy was
Constantinople by the
atheistic,
Crusaders,
and
in
the Church
AD
condemned it
1204,
as both heretical and
the
false.
Greek manuscripts of
Probably the
Aristotle's
discovery
writings
of
were
the
brought
Earth's
to Paris,
globular shape
and at a
had
subsequent
first
period
suggested the idea
they were
of a
translated
finite
into
universe
Latin
to
under the
Parmenides.
direction of St. Thomas
At any
Aquinas,
rate,
the
the
ablest
discovery
of the
of the
schoolmen,
Earth's motion
who so manipulated
suggested
the
the idea of
peripatetic
an
philosophy
infinite universe to his
as to
Greek-souled
convert it
Italian
from a battering
successor
ram
into a
or
buttress
rather it was
of
the
Catholic
breakup of
theology,
Aristotle's
a
spherical
position
world
still
by
officially assigned to it at the
that
present
threw
day.
Bruno back, as he gives us
Aristotelianism,
himself to
however,
understand,
did not reign
on
without
the
a
older
rival,
Ionian
even in the
cosmologies,
later Middle Ages.
with their assumption of infinite
Aquinas
space
was a
and
Dominican,
infinite worlds.
and the jealousy
In
of
this
the
reference,
competing
Bruno
Franciscan
went
order
far beyond
found
Copernicus and
expression
even
in
Kepler,
maintaining a certain certain
for both
tradition
had
of
assumed, in
Platonism,
deference to
represented
current opinion,
in different
that the
ways
fixed
by
stars
Roger
were
Bacon,
equidistant from the solar
1214
system,
to
and formed
1294,
a single sphere,
and by Duns
enclosing
Scotus,
it on all sides.
1265 to 1308.
He, on the contrary, anticipated
In this
modern
connection, we
astronomy
have to
in
note the
conceiving the stars
extraordinary
as so many
fertility
suns
of the British Islands
dispersed
in
without
eminent thinkers
assignable
during the Middle
limits through
Ages.
space, and
Besides the two last mentioned, there is Eriugena, born in Ireland,
had been
John of
closely
Salisbury,
associated by
1115 to
Democritus and
1180,
with infinite
the first
atoms.
humanist,
William
and the
of
next
Ockham,
great step taken by
Wycliffe,
Bruno,
the first
was to
reformer,
rehabilitate
making
atomism
six in all,
as a necessary
a larger
concept of modern
contribution than
science.
any other region
He
of
figured
Europe,
the atoms
or
as
indeed
very
all the
minute
rest of
spheres
Europe
of
put
solid
together,
earthy matter,
as made to
forming
the stars
by
of
their combinations the
scholasticism.
framework of visible
This advantage
bodies.
is probably not due
But
to
their
any
combinations are
inherent
by
genius
no
or
means
philosophy in the
fortuitous,
inhabitants
as Democritus
of these
had
islands,
impiously
but
supposed.
to their relative immunity
Nor do they
from
move
war,
through an
and
absolute
to the
void.
political liberty that
All
cannot
space
but
is
have
filled
been
with an
favorable
ocean of
to
liquid
independent
ether,
thought,
which is nothing other
5 out
than
of the 6 were more or
of
less
which
inclined
Aristotle's
to Platonism,
celestial spheres
and their
were composed.
idealist or mystical
Only in
tendencies
Bruno's
were
system,
sometimes
it
associated
takes the place
with
of
the
that
same
first
practicality
matter,
that
which is the
distinguished
extreme
their master.
antithesis of the
The
disembodied
sixth
form,
commonly called
personified
Occam,
in the prime
who
mover,
died about
God.
1349,
And
here
here
we
we
famous
come
as the
to that
champion
reversal
of
of cosmic
nominalism,
values brought about
that
by the
is,
reversal of the
doctrine
relations
that
between
genera
earth and
and
sun,
species have
which
no real
Copernicus had
existence,
effected.
either in nature
The primordial
or in
matter,
mind.
so
There
far
are
from
only
passively
individuals,
receiving the
more
forms
or less
imposed on it from
resembling
without,
one another.
has an infinite
He is the
capacity
author of
for
the famous
evolving
saying,
forms from
"The
its
sole
own
legacy
bosom,
of scholasticism
and so
to
far
common
from
thought,
being unspiritual,
entities ought
is
not
itself
to be
the
gratuitously
universal spirit,
multiplied,
the creative
Entia
and
non
animating
sunt
soul of the world.
praeternecessitatem
The first matter,
multiplicanda.
form, energy, life,
The capture
and
of
reason
Constantinople
are
by the
identified
Crusaders
with
had
nature,
led to Aristotle's
nature with
triumph
the
in the
universe,
13th century,
and the universe
200
with God.
years later. The
So
conquering
far all
Ottoman
is clear,
advance
if not
on the same
convincing.
city was
It
the
is
immediate
otherwise
cause
with the
of his
theory
overthrow.
of monads.
For the Byzantine
This
scholars
is only
who fled for
expounded in
help and
Bruno's
refuge
Latin
to Italy
works,
brought
for
with
the most
them the
part
manuscripts
ill-written
of
and
Plato
hopelessly
and
obscure.
Plotinus, and these
It seems
soon became
possible that
known
by
to
the
Western
monads,
Europe
through
through
the
the
Latin
Latin
translations
translations the
of
infinitesimal
Marcellio
parts into
Ficino.
which the ether of space
On
may
its literary
conceivably
side,
be divided.
the Platonic revival
Each of
fell
these
in
possesses
admirably
consciousness,
with the humanism
and therefore
to which the
may be
schoolmen
considered
had
as
long been
reflecting and
intensely
representing the whole
distasteful.
universe.
And the religious
A number
movement
of
that
monads, or
preceded
rather a
Luther's
continuous
Reformation,
portion of the ether
found a
surrounding and
welcome ally
interpenetrating
in
a group of
Neoplatonic
atoms,
mysticism.
endows them with the forms
At
and
the same
qualities
time,
of the invention
elementary
of printing,
bodies,
by opening the
ascending
world of
gradually
books to
through
non-academic
vegetal and
readers,
animal organizations
vastly
to
widened
human
the
beings.
possibilities of independent
But the
thought.
animating process
And
does
the
not stop with
Reformation, by
man.
discrediting the
The
scholastic
Earth, with the other
theology in
planets,
northern Europe,
the Sun,
dealt
and all the
another
stars
blow
are
at
also
the system
monads
with which
on the
it had been
largest
associated
scale.
by
With
Aquinas.
reasonable souls,
It has been
just
supposed
as Aristotle
that
thought.
the discovery of America
In fact,
and
the
the
old
circumnavigation
mythology
of the
whence he
globe
derived the
contributed
idea
also to the
repeats
impending
itself in his
philosophical
great
revolution.
enemy Bruno.
But the true theory
Beyond
of the Earth's
and above all
figure
these
formed the
partial
very foundation
unities
of
is
Aristotle's
the monus
cosmology,
monandum,
and was as
the
well known to
supreme
Dante
unity,
as to ourselves.
the infinite God,
who is
made
the
by
soul
a
of the
fervent
infinite
Catholic,
universe, acting under the
Doubtless
patronage
there
of the
is
Catholic
here a
Queen
reminiscence
par
of the
excellence.
Neoplatonic
The
one.
discovery of Columbus
ineffable
increased the
absolute
prestige
beyond
of
all
Catholicism,
existence,
by
yet
opening
endowed
a
with
new
the
world to
infinite
its
power
missions
whence all
and
existence
adding to the
proceeds.
wealth of its supporters
Bruno
in the Old
had learned
World.
from Cardinal Nicholas of
The
Cusa,
decisive
a Copernican
blow to medieval
before Copernicus,
ideas came from
to
another
recognize
quarter,
the principle
from
of
the
Heraclitus,
Copernican astronomy.
that opposites are one.
What the true
And
theory
in
of
this
the Earth's
instance he
motion
applies
meant
it
for
with brilliant
philosophy has not
audacity.
always been rightly
For
understood.
every infinitesimal
It
part
seems
of
to
the
be
space
commonly
filling ether
supposed
is
that
no
the
less
heliocentric
the soul
system
of the universe
excited
than
hostility
the monad of
because
monads
it degraded
itself.
the Earth from her
And both
proud
agree
position
in
as center
being
of the
non-existent
universe,
in the sense of being
but the reverse is
transfinite.
true. Since there can be no
According to
sum of
Aristotle
infinity
and his
and no
scholastic
animated
followers,
mathematical
the center
points,
of the universe
is
from
the lowest
Anaximander
and
to
least
Plotinus,
honorable.
there is hardly
The
a great Greek
circumference,
thinker whose
the
influence
highest and
cannot
most
be traced in the
distinguished
system
position
of
in it.
Giordano Bruno.
And that is why
And
Earth,
while he represents
as the
the
vilest
philosophical
of the four
Renaissance in
elements,
this
tends
eminent
to the
degree,
center.
he
While
heads the
fire,
two
being
lines
the
of
most
speculation
precious,
which,
flies upward.
separately or combined,
Again, the
run through the
incorruptible
whole history
ether
of
of which the
modern
heavens are
metaphysics.
composed
The
shows its
monistic
eternal
and what is
character
now
by
called
moving
the
forever round in a
pluralistic
circle
tendency,
of which God, as
with
prime
none,
mover,
except perhaps with Hegel,
occupies the
have the two
outermost
been
verge.
perfectly balanced.
And
And
this
in Bruno
metaphysical
himself,
topography is
the leaning
faithfully
is
followed by
distinctly
Dante,
towards
who
plurality,
even improves on
his
it
supreme
by
monad
placing the
being
worst
a mere
criminals,
survival
that is,
from
the
the
rebels and traitors,
Platonic
Satan
One.
with Judas and Brutus
End
and Cassius
of section 1.
in the eternal ice at the very centre of the earth. Such fancies were incompatible with the new astronomy. No longer cold and dead, our earth might henceforth take her place among the stars, animated like them, if animated they were, and suggested by analogy that they too supported teeming multitudes of reasonable inhabitants. But the transposition of values did not end there. Aristotle's whole philosophy had been based on a radical antithesis between the sublunary and the superlunary spheres, the world of growth, decay, vicissitude, and the world of everlasting realities. In the sublunary sphere also it distinguished sharply between the forms of things, which were eternal, and the matter on which they were imposed, an intangible, evanescent thing, related to form as possibility to actuality. We know that these two convenient categories are logically independent of the false cosmology that may or may not have suggested their world-wide application, but the immediate effect of having it denied, or even doubted, was greatly to exalt the credit of matter or power at the expense of form or act. The first to draw these revolutionary inferences from the Copernican theory was Giordano Bruno, 1548 to 1600. Born at Nola, a South Italian city not far from Naples, Bruno entered the Dominican order before the age of 15, and on that occasion exchanged his baptismal name of Filippo for that by which he has ever since been known. Here he became acquainted with the whole of ancient and medieval philosophy, besides the Copernican astronomy, then not yet condemned by the Church. At the early age of 18 he first came into collision with the authorities, and at 28, in 1576, he openly questioned the chief characteristic dogmas of Catholicism, was menaced with an action for heresy, and fled from the convent. The pursuit must have been rather perfunctory, for Bruno found himself free to spend 2 years wandering from one Italian city to another, earning a precarious livelihood by tuition and authorship. Leaving Italy at last, rather from a desire to push his fortunes abroad than from any fear of molestation, and finding France too hot to hold him, he tried Geneva for a little while, but on being given to understand that he could only stay on the condition of embracing Calvinism, returned to France, where he lived first for 2 years as professor of philosophy at Toulouse, and 3 more in a somewhat less official position at Paris. Thence, in the train of the French ambassador, he passed to England, where his 2 years' sojourn seems to have been the happiest and most fruitful period of his restless career. It was cut short by his chief's return to Paris. But the philosopher's fearless advocacy of Copernicanism made that bigoted capital impossible. The truth, however, seems to be that Bruno never could hit it off with any one or any society, and the next 5 years spent in trying to make himself acceptable at one German university after another are a record of hopeless failure. Finally, in an evil hour, he goes to Venice at the invitation of a young noble, Mocenigo, who, in revenge for disappointed expectations, betrays him to the Inquisition. Questioned about his heresies, Bruno showed perfect willingness to accept all the theological dogmas that he had formally denied. Whether he withdrew his retractation on being transferred from a Venetian to a Roman prison does not appear, as the Roman depositions are not forthcoming. Neither is it clear why so long a delay as 6 years, from 1594 to 1600, was granted to the philosopher when such short work was made of other heretics. It seems most probable that Bruno, while pliant enough on questions of religious belief, remained inflexible in maintaining the infinity of inhabited worlds. When the final condemnation was read out, he told the judges that he heard it with less fear than they felt in pronouncing it. In the customary euphemistic terms, they had sent him to death by fire. At the stake, when the crucifix was held up to him, he turned away his eyes. With what thoughts we cannot tell. There is a monument to the heroic thinker at Nola, and another in the Campo dei Fiori, on the spot where he suffered at Rome, raised against the strongest protests of the ecclesiastical authorities. The Greek-Italian philosophers, the Pythagoreans and Parmenides, had introduced the idea of finiteness or limitation as a necessary condition of reality and perfection into thought. From them it passed over to Plato and Aristotle, who made it dominant in the schools. Epicurus and Lucretius had indeed carried on the older Ionian tradition of infinite atoms and infinite worlds dispersed through infinite space, but their philosophy was practically atheistic, and the Church condemned it as both heretical and false. Probably the discovery of the earth's globular shape had first suggested the idea of a finite universe to Parmenides. At any rate, the discovery of the earth's motion suggested the idea of an infinite universe to his Greek-souled Italian successor, or rather it was the break-up of Aristotle's spherical world by Copernicanism that threw Bruno back, as he gives us himself to understand, on the older Ionian cosmologies, with their assumption of infinite space and infinite worlds. In this reference, Bruno went far beyond Copernicus and even Kepler, for both had assumed, in deference to current opinion, that the fixed stars were equidistant from the solar system, and formed a single sphere enclosing it on all sides. He, on the contrary, anticipated modern astronomy in conceiving the stars as so many suns dispersed without assignable limits through space, and each surrounded by inhabited planets. Infinite space had been closely associated by Democritus and Epicurus with infinite atoms, and the next great step taken by Bruno was to rehabilitate atomism as a necessary concept of modern science. He figured the atoms as very minute spheres of solid earthy matter, forming by their combinations the framework of visible bodies. But their combinations are by no means fortuitous, as Democritus had impiously supposed, nor do they move through an absolute void. All space is filled with an ocean of liquid ether, which is nothing other than the quintessence of which Aristotle's celestial spheres were composed. Only in Bruno's system it takes the place of that first matter, which is the extreme antithesis of the disembodied form, personified in the prime mover, God. And here we come to that reversal of cosmic values brought about by the reversal of the relations between earth and sun, which Copernicus had effected. The primordial matter, so far from passively receiving the forms imposed on it from without, has an infinite capacity for evolving forms from its own bosom, and so far from being unspiritual, is itself the universal spirit, the creative and animating soul of the world. The first matter, form, energy, life, and reason, are identified with nature, nature with the universe, and the universe with God. So far all is clear, if not convincing. It is otherwise with the theory of monads. This is only expounded in Bruno's Latin works, for the most part ill-written and hopelessly obscure. It seems possible that by the monads Bruno sometimes means the infinitesimal parts into which the ether of space may conceivably be divided. Each of these possesses consciousness, and therefore may be considered as reflecting and representing the whole universe. A number of monads, or rather a continuous portion of the ether surrounding and interpenetrating a group of atoms, endows them with the forms and qualities of elementary bodies, ascending gradually through vegetal and animal organizations to human beings. But the animating process does not stop with man. The earth, with the other planets, the sun, and all the stars are also monads on the largest scale, with reasonable souls, just as Aristotle thought. In fact, the old mythology whence he derived the idea repeats itself in his great enemy Bruno. Beyond and above all these partial unities is the monus monadum, the supreme unity, the infinite God, who is the soul of the infinite universe. Doubtless there is here a reminiscence of the Neo-Platonic One, the ineffable absolute beyond all existence, yet endowed with the infinite power whence all existence proceeds. Bruno had learned from Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, a Copernican before Copernicus, to recognise the principle of Heraclitus, that opposites are one, and in this instance he applies it with brilliant audacity, for every infinitesimal part of the space-filling ether is no less the soul of the universe than the monad of monads itself. And both agree in being non-existent in the sense of being transfinite, since there can be no sum of infinity and no animated mathematical points. From Anaximander to Plotinus, there is hardly a great Greek thinker whose influence cannot be traced in the system of Giordano Bruno. And while he represents the philosophical Renaissance in this eminent degree, he heads the two lines of speculation which, separately or combined, run through the whole history of modern metaphysics, the monistic and what is now called the pluralistic tendency. With none, except perhaps with Hegel, have the two been perfectly balanced, and in Bruno himself the leaning is distinctly towards plurality, his supreme monad being a mere survival from the Neo-Platonic One. End of section 1.